Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a pretty large 12-game slate that starts at 6:30 this afternoon. This slate is fairly good. There is a lot of good options in the value ranges, as well as some decent upside plays available. It's definitely a guard-heavy slate. There's definitely more guards that are viable today than forwards, but there's good players across the board at all the price ranges that you could want, and so you can definitely generate some really good lineups today. It's a pretty deep slate as well because there's a lot of good teams playing. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 teams in the top 25 playing, including one matchup between two top 25 teams. And then as far as the scoring in the games, we have several games over 150 points, and then several games under 135 points, including the lowest game, which is North Carolina and Virginia at 129 points. So the highest scoring game is actually I believe Xavier and DePaul, as well as Arizona and Stanford games, both being at 153 points each. We have a couple blowouts. That would be the Xavier game and the Maryland game, potentially. And then we have some pretty tight games as well, where we have just literally a half a point in the Virginia game. Also, a couple 2-point games throughout the slate. So overall, it's a very interesting slate. We have a lot of good defensive teams playing, a lot of good offensive teams playing as well, and then we have some some good teams and some really bad teams like DePaul, who's I think one of two teams that has a losing record on the slate. Them in Minnesota. Actually, there's three. Stanford as well. So three teams that are kind of really bad, but we have a lot of good teams here, and so let's go ahead and get started in the slate. I'm going to start with my core plays here, and we're going to start with Nick Smith for Arkansas. He's got a nice matchup here against Auburn, and in 3 of the 5 games since being back starting, he's had 5x performances in 3 of them, and 2 of them haven't been great, but that's his floor. It's not super ideal, but he has good upside in this matchup, and he should score a lot in a game that should be a little bit higher scoring game on the slate. Then we're going to look at Justin Moore for Villanova. Now, he's had 7 straight games over 23 fantasy points, giving him a decent floor. He should get good minutes here as well, and he has a nice matchup here against Creighton. Should be a good game and a tight game as well. Then we'll look at PJ Hall for Clemson. He hasn't 5x in a while, but he has nice upside in this game, which should be decent scoring. He also has a pretty safe floor. He's not a guy that's going to score 50 fantasy points, but he's going to get you in mid-30s, and we do like that on this slate. Then we're going to look at Dylan Dessou for Texas. He has a very low floor. His minutes are a little bit sketchy, but he's got a good matchup and a high ceiling here. He's played pretty well lately, and so I do think he's viable on the slate. You just have to keep in mind that he does have that low floor, but I do think he's a viable play regardless of that. So with that said, let's get into my other picks for each position. We're going to start with some more expensive players, and we're going to start with Marquise Noel at $9,700. He is one of the more expensive players on the slate, but he does seem like the best player when it comes to being over $9,000. He's played pretty well lately, and he's done well versus TCU in the past. Look for him to be a good play here. Then we're going to look at Boogie Ellis for USC. Now, this is a low-scoring game, but he is a really good play here. He has had some massive games lately. He does have and he's got a very even game versus ASU, so I look for him to play well in this one. He's also dominated ASU several times. He's got good upside and a pretty safe floor on the slate, so I do think he's a viable option here. Then we're going to look at Trey Alexander for Creighton. Now, he's a little bit less expensive and a little bit more expensive than Nick Smith. He's a good secondary option off of Nick Smith if you want. This is a lower scoring game, but he does have a good floor, though it's not quite as appealing because of the lower scoring game, but he has good upside and he is playing well. Then we're going to look at Ezra Majan from Vanderbilt. Sorry for butchering your name. Since he started starting again, he's been really good. His worst game was versus Kentucky, but this matchup with LSU is very appealing. I definitely think he's a very good option on the slate. Then we're going to look at some value plays at this position, and we're going to start with Resmus Melendez for Illinois. Now, he's interesting today because if he does if Epps doesn't come back today, which he might, then Rasmus will have some good upside here, but we do want to make sure that Epps is out. If Epps plays, then Melendez will no longer be viable on the slate. For LSU, Trey Hannibal, if he joins the starting lineup, he would be a must play on the slate. But we do need to make sure that he starts in this game, and it is a late game, so it may not be too easy to tell. And that really depends on other situations on LSU. Then we're going to look at Cam Carter for Kansas State. He's played really well in some games lately. He has a very low floor. He has a very high ceiling. He can 5x or 6x or 7x in a couple games this season. So his price was a little bit higher during the season, but he's in a pretty good spot here. And assuming he plays a pretty good amount of minutes, he should be a good option on the slate as a value play. But remember, he does have a low floor. As for the forwards, we're going to take a look at Harrison Ingram at $7,400. He's a very interesting play. He's played really well lately, and he should be a high-scoring game here. The risk here is that his team loses by double digits, but I do think he's viable on the slate. Brandon Angel is in a similar situation with the game potentially being lopsided here, but he's played well lately, and it could get a little ugly, but his price is good, and he's been playing consistent despite the fact his team's had some struggles. He is still putting up good fantasy numbers most games. His price is pretty fair here. Then we're going to look at some value plays for this forward position, and we're going to look at David Gessen. I don't know how to say your name, sorry. He's a very viable option here if he starts, but that will have to be determined if he ends up starting here. He has a pretty good ceiling if he does draw the start here, but it's still risky unless he is locked in to start. And then we'll look at Tyreek Smith for Oklahoma State. Now, this is very contingent on him drawing a start as well, but he should be viable on the slate. It looks like he should play around 20 to 25 minutes if he starts, and if he does that, he has really good upside. He's played really well in these types of situations this season. So now let's get into my breakdown of each individual team. We have a lot of games, like I said, so we have some good matchups here. And we're going to start with this Penn State game against Illinois. Now, both these teams are projected to score a pretty even amount of points, around 70 points each. It has a 39-point spread. For Illinois, Mayer and Hawkins have some interesting upside, but they aren't priced as nice as I'd like them to be. And then, of course, Melendez, if he starts, he'd have some value availability here. But he, again, that's not a must play by any stretch at this point. So we'll have to wait and see on that news. As for the defense of Penn State, that definitely gives Illinois some upside on this matchup. As for Penn State, we can make some arguments for Pickett and Funk due to recent play, but it's hard to love them in this one. Just feels the same about Lundy, who's been big versus Illinois, but I don't feel great about any of them. Illinois' defense isn't great, but it is a lot better than Penn State, and Penn State's offense has been largely lethargic for most of the season. Though it is a relatively tight game, so it could have, a potential overtime situation going there. But anyway, we'll go ahead and get into the Xavier DePaul game here. Now for Xavier, they are one of the highest scoring teams, and this is the highest scoring game on the slate. But it also has some blowout risk. All 5 starters plus Claude have some upside here. They're priced well for the matchup, and they have a pretty balanced team. And DePaul really doesn't play much defense, one of the worst defenses on the slate. As for DePaul, Uganda and Javon Johnson are interesting but very risky. Jalen Terry has low in value play here if he continues to start, but I'm still not sure that I want to mess with anybody on this team too much, as Xavier's team does tend to play pretty well defensively. Then we're going to look at the Virginia and North Carolina game. Now, this game is somewhat interesting because it's a 1-point spread, and this is a game that's kind of a must-win for UNC. Both these teams are pretty average defensively, and UNC has actually played pretty well offensively, despite the fact they're very inconsistent. Love and Nance are the only guys that I really think are decent, though, for North Carolina. They are in a must-win situation, so they are worth taking a look at, but they are pretty risky. As for Virginia, it's just an ugly matchup and a low-scoring game. The safest player on this team is Gardner, but that's not saying much. I don't know why you would want to, but you could add Franklin and Beekman as a secondary play, but I don't love it, and I think I'd stay away from their team for the most part. As for the Arkansas Auburn game here, now this game has a 3-point game spread, and it is a higher scoring game on the slate. Both teams play pretty good defense, though, so do keep that in mind. But for Arkansas, Nick Smith has been dominant in the games that he's been back. Black and Council both have some nice upside here as well, and Wash is a good value play. Who I'd like more if he draws a start, obviously, but if he does play, he tends to play well. As for Auburn, they aren't projected to win the game, but Brom, Green, and Williams and Flanagan all have some upside in this game. They are somewhat risky, though, lots of streaky plays as of late, but they are a good offensive team and a good defensive team, so they have potential to win this game. And then we're going to look at the Big 12 game between Texas and Oklahoma State. Now, this game is pretty interesting. It's a 6-point spread in Texas's favor. Both teams do play really good defense. Texas is the better offense. Disu and Hunter have high ceiling, low floor situations. Rice has also been playing really well. Carr and Allen are secondary options, but somewhat risky on a tight game like this. As for Oklahoma State, this could be an ugly game for them. No player looks that great. They are streaky, though you could say Tyreek Smith, if he starts, has some secondary value potential. If you think Oklahoma State can hang with Texas, you could throw a Hail Mary at Thompson and Asbury as well. So then we're going to get on to the Arizona-Stanford game here. Let me fix this here real quick. Arizona and Stanford. All right. And so for this particular game, this is one of the higher scoring games on the slate. Actually, the second highest scoring game on the slate. Arizona is favored to win the game by 9 points. They are a great offensive team and a great defensive team, so they are projected to do well here. You could throw in Tubelis, but he has really good upside, but he hasn't really been that great against Stanford simply because he doesn't play a ton of minutes against them when he has played them, since I guess they've been lopsided games. And I look for this game to be a potentially lopsided game as well. Larson and Boswell have some upside off the bench. Everyone else seems a little bit overpriced for them, but they do all have some low-end upside if you want to, take a flyer on some of them. As for Stanford, all 5 starters do have some upside despite being in a tough game. They have played Arizona well, including a win this season. Not sure that they can win again, but they do seem to be one of the few teams that match up well against them. Jones, Ingram, and Engel are all decent plays. O'Connell and Raynard have some secondary upside as well. So despite the fact that they're not a great team, they do seem to match up well against Arizona. As for the Maryland-Minnesota game, I do think this game is somewhat interesting today. Reese is the best play for Minnesota. For Maryland. Everyone else does seem pretty risky here. This game is a 12-point game. 12-point spread for Maryland's favor. Neither team is very good offensively or defensively, so I think Maryland will probably blow this game out. But Reese would be the only guy that I really like here. If you want to go deep into the bench, you could look at Ian Martinez and Donald Carey as some cheap play upside, but they are somewhat risky on this game. As for Maryland, Minnesota, they're one of the lowest scoring teams on the slate. It's a rough matchup where they just played yesterday and will play a team that smashed them by 40 last time they played. If you want to go crazy, you could load up and battle Henley and Garcia, but it just feels crazy. I don't see any reason to do that, and I would probably steer clear of them in general. Then we're going to look at an ACC matchup between Cleveland against Clemson and North Carolina State here. Now, this game is somewhat interesting. North Carolina State is favored to win the game by 2 points. Both teams are average offensively, but North Carolina State is the worst defensive team on the slate. But they do have some games that they're okay. As for North Carolina State, Joyner is the safest play here. Burns is a secondary play. And if Gant is ruled out, that would give some upside to Duwanda and Jack Clark. But we'll have to wait and see on that. As for Clemson, you can make a solid argument for all of their starters, as they are a pretty decent offensive team, and like I said, North Carolina State's not good defensively. Hunter, Tyson, and a couple others all have some upside in this matchup. Just take a look at their starters and draw from them. As for a Big 12 matchup between Texas, TCU, and Kansas State, this game has a really good 2-point spread. It's also a pretty high-scoring game on the slate, and so I do like it. I think it's viable. This is the only matchup between 2 top 25 teams. Neither team is a particularly great offensive team, and both teams are about average defensively as well. TCU being slightly better. For TCU, they are somewhat tough to use. Aside from Ball and Miller, they have very streaky minutes, but a few injuries do give PB Wells and Cole and Cork some upside, secondary upside. Miller having the best upside on the slate, best upside of the players on the team, however. As for Kansas State, that's a decent scoring game here, and 3 players look solid for K-State. Carter has very low floor, but has a really high ceiling. Negesen has assuming he starts, sorry for butchering your name, has a good value here, and so then Noel also has some high-end upside in a high-scoring game. Keontae Johnson is also a good secondary play. Then we're going to look at the next matchup here between 2 Big East teams in Creighton and Villanova. Now this game is very interesting. It's a 4-point spread for Creighton, and they don't have a very good offensive team, whereas Villanova has a good offensive team, and both teams are slightly above average defensively. As for Creighton, it is a low-scoring game, though, so Trey Alexander has some upside here, and Nimhard is a good secondary play, but everybody else is way overpriced, and I was really worried that they were going to be fairly priced, which would make it hard to pass on some of these guys, but I definitely don't think they're really worth using. Just take a look at Trey Alexander and Nimhard and then move on to another team. As for Villanova, Whitmore and Moore both have good available options here. They are somewhat risky, though, but Dixon has some secondary upside. It's an interesting game because of the lower scoring aspect of the game, but it still has some potential to have a good matchup here. Then we'll look at Vanderbilt and LSU. And this is a good SEC matchup here for Vanderbilt, who rarely is a team that looks like they're going to be favored to win, but they're favored to win by 3 points. Both these teams have pretty bad offenses and pretty okay defenses, with LSU being a much better defensive team. Majon and Lawrence do have some upside for Vanderbilt, and they look like the best players on the slate. Wright has some upside if he starts as a secondary play, and then Melora Brown has some value upside on a relief starter due to injuries. As for LSU, Trey Hannibal, if he starts, has some good upside here. KJ Williams also seems fairly priced, and so does Adam Miller. And so we'll definitely have to take a look at how they end up with their starting lineup. But they do have some upside here. And then the last game on the slate, we have USC and Arizona State. This is the latest game, and this game is a 2-point spread. Both teams are pretty average defensively, and then USC is a better offensive team. Boogie Ellis is the big scorer here. He has dominated Arizona State several times and has nice upside. Trey White has some low-end upside as well. If you want to pull from this game, those are the guys to do it with. Being one of the lower-scoring teams on the slate for Arizona State, it seems very easy to move away from them. They are a bad offensive team, and no one is hardly worth mentioning. If you want someone to throw on the team, Washington and Horn would have the most upside, but they are very risky. And so that's what I have for this slate. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you guys for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.